Well, we can now speak to Natasha Hausdorff. She's a barrister and international law expert who also liaises with UK lawyers in Israel. And she joins me now from London. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good morning, Katia.
First of all, in this situation, good morning, this very tense situation, people are looking for glimmers of hope. One of those being the arrival of the first trucks of aid. Another, the release of two of the hostages currently held inside Gaza. A reminder, we're 2 weeks on today from a massacre inside Israel, 1,400 people killed. The number of hostages taken into Gaza has been updated by Israel today to 210. That's in addition to the two who were released overnight. I was just wondering if I could ask you, from a legal perspective, how do governments go about trying to negotiate the release of these hostages? What concessions could be offered, even though we've been told in this case none were? How would it work?
Well, of course, the negotiations and the international diplomacy associated is a separate consideration entirely from the legal position. And we've heard, certainly from your reporting this morning, about international efforts behind the developments. But of course, those developments need to be seen in the context of this abduction, as you've been reporting, of over 200 hostages and those crimes of Hamas and other Palestinian terrorist organizations which have led to a humanitarian crisis. Also in Israel, where the families of these hostages know that the orders of these terrorists were specifically to target women and children for kidnap and torture. The international law aspects of this are, of course, extremely important, and myths about Israel's conduct, about international law, have been playing a significant role in this crisis and in the coverage of it. And perhaps I can be clear that from an international law perspective, Israel does not only have the right to a robust response, but under the Convention on the Prevention and the Punishment of Genocide, the crime of genocide, it also has an affirmative obligation, like the rest of the signatories to that convention, to make sure that never again means never again.
Well, as you say, under international law, Israel has the right to defend itself. As we've been saying, these attacks orchestrated by Hamas inside Israel 2 weeks ago today were unprecedented. We're talking about a massacre as well as hostage taking of people, including women and children. Also under international law, though, as well as the right to defend yourself as a party, there are also rules of war and engagement. So it's not that you can't defend yourself, it's how you defend yourself in the situation. In this case, how Israel defends itself. And there's been a lot of concentration. We've been talking about aid today, the plight of Palestinian civilians on the ground, that siege that's been tightened on the Gaza Strip. Until today, no food, no water, no medical supplies, aerial bombardments day and night, aimed, Israel says, at Hamas and Hamas infrastructure. But the number of casualties amongst civilians has been very, very high.
Well, let me pick up, if I may, on those points in turn. In compliance with its obligations under international law to minimize civilian casualties, Israel is issuing warnings of where it will be striking Hamas terrorist infrastructure. It's a practice used by all law-abiding countries. It is telling them to leave in order to try to save their lives. And of course, there has also been mass evacuation of Israeli civilians from the north and south of Israel, away from the borders with terrorist organizations. But there is another myth here, that Israel has an obligation to supply Hamas terrorists with electricity and other goods, and that is without basis in international law. Israel is not required to fund or assist Hamas war efforts as it attempts to butcher Jews. And of course, since Hamas violently seized control in 2007, Israel has continued to provide a part of Gaza's fuel, electricity, water, and also medical care to Palestinian civilians that Hamas neglects and abuses. That isn't viable during a military campaign where Hamas exploits these transfers, stealing supplies and penetrating humanitarian organizations to mask its terror operations and to launder funds. And Hamas uses the electricity grid in Gaza to continue to fire missiles onto Israeli civilians. That firing has continued in the course of the last hour and your broadcasts. And of course, some of these rockets from Gaza fall short, as we saw with the Al Ali hospital car park. in the case of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a third of the rockets fired in the last exchange of theirs fell short, killing many Gazan civilians. But I must stress, in relation to your question, there is no requirement to provide resources. International law only requires that Israel facilitate the passage of food and medicine by third parties if such goods can be reliably delivered without diversion to Hamas. And we know that is not the case because Hamas controls Gaza. And in fact, the basic rules outlined by the Geneva and the Hague Conventions are that sieges are lawful unless they are deliberately aimed at starving the local population. The IDF has been repeatedly clear about its objectives: defeating Hamas, establishing a new reality in Gaza where Israel doesn't face a genocidal terror organization that has the will or capability to attack Israeli civilians, and rescuing the hostages. And if governments and international organizations...
And Natasha Hausdorff, if I could just interrupt you there. Sorry, just a moment, Natasha Hausdorff. Sorry to interrupt you, but you've made a number of points very clearly from your perspective. As you say, under international law, and I, unlike you, I am not an international lawyer. Israel in this case, it is allowed by parties under international law, if they can argue their reasons why, to have a siege. But what is not allowed under international law is something that is alleged by aid agencies, for example, and they say that what the effect on Palestinian civilians stuck inside Gaza, they say, seems like collective punishment. Seems like collective punishment. They say collective punishment is not allowed under international law. Of course, all of these legal questions are hotly contested.
Well, it's flatly not borne out by the facts on the ground. And if these aid organizations are invested in the interests of Gazan civilians, then they should devote their resources to facilitating the safe and rapid evacuation of Gazan civilian population to the south, which Hamas has been seeking to hamper with reports of it bombing fleeing civilians. But the allegation that you have raised, Katya, is a reprehensible moral equivalence, and it is being drawn, it is utterly morally repugnant. It also attaches, of course, to the suggestion of proportionality in international law, that is about comparing casualty figures, and that is also not correct. Every strike that Israel takes, every military action is weighed up, it is analysed to make sure that according to international law, the anticipated collateral damage, the harm to civilians, is proportionate to the military aims of a strike that is militarily necessary and legitimately targets terrorist infrastructure. So these suggestions of collective punishment are morally reprehensible, liable.
As Natasha Hausdorff, you say that these allegations aren't borne out by facts on the ground. It is objective bodies such as the International Criminal Court, for example, who are brought up in times of conflict to examine situations in every single individual case about whether the rules of law or engagement were respected in individual particular cases. But we thank you very much for your time this morning, for joining us. Natasha Hausdorff there, international lawyer, barrister who also advises UK lawyers inside Israel.